Welcome to Heart, Soul and Melanin. I'm here to tell you about people who've earned their love stories, the ones who've spent years being strong and are finally ready to be seen. These are the London love stories, Black British romance for anyone who's reached the midpoint of life. Hit subscribe because every week we bring you a new story. Real bodies, real struggles, real love. This is The Night Shift, and it starts with a woman who'd spent 15 years alone, a broken kettle, and a man who made her remember what desire felt like. Let's begin. The double doors of King's College Hospital's A&E unit burst open, slamming against the crash pads. A trauma team was wheeling in a woman in extremis, a severe placental abruption, massive blood loss, and a fetal heart rate plummeting towards single digits. Simone Richards, the senior midwife on shift, moved with a practiced, lethal efficiency. 25 years of experience told her the mother was crashing. Her heart was a steady, rhythmic anchor, but the blood slicking the linoleum was a terrible, vivid red. Her primary focus, the only thing that mattered in the world, was to stabilize the mother long enough for the emergency C-section to begin. "We're losing her, Midwife Richards. Need a consultant on site now," the junior doctor shouted, his voice cracking. Behind the doctor, a deep voice cut through the chaos, commanding and immediate. "Talk to me. What have we got?" David Okonkwo. Even in the crisis, Simone was intensely aware of the new A&E consultant. He moved with a quiet, heavy gravity, bringing with him a scent that sliced through the ward's antiseptic air, sharp, clean, undeniably masculine. "Catastrophic PPH. Fetal heart rate is non-viable. We're proceeding with a perimortem C-section," Simone said, her eyes never leaving the mother's ashen face. Large hands encased in sterile latex appeared beside hers. David was a big man, his head shaved clean, his salt and pepper goatee groomed to a sharp, neat edge. "I'm stabilizing the mother's airways," he stated. His voice didn't just carry, it vibrated through the floorboards. Simone worked in synchronized silence with him, her eyes darting between the monitors and his steady, deliberate movements. Within minutes, the immediate threat to the mother receded just enough. A fragile, screaming life was brought into the world. As the tension in the room broke, David stepped away. He reached up, hooked the latex at his wrists, and stripped off his gloves with a sharp, rhythmic snap. Simone's eyes involuntarily tracked the movement. His bare hands were large, the skin a rich, dark chocolate, his nails buffed and impeccably clean. On his left hand, a gold wedding ring caught the harsh overhead light. David looked up. His eyes were a striking, warm chocolate brown. For a heartbeat, he wasn't looking at the monitors. He was looking at her lips. It was a heavy, lingering gaze that made Simone's breath hitch. Then he smiled, showing large, straight, incredibly white teeth. The sight of that smile sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated heat straight to Simone's core. It was a thought she had no business having in a delivery room, much less about a married man. "I wonder how those teeth would feel against my neck." The thought was so sudden, so inappropriate, that she felt a literal heat crawl up her throat. "Nice work, midwife," he said. "I did my job, doctor," she replied, her voice more clipped than she intended. She turned away quickly, her pulse racing with a terrifying new adrenaline. Simone stepped out of the ward, her hands still shaking from the adrenaline. She made it halfway down the corridor when she heard the heavy, rhythmic tread of someone following her. "Midwife Richards," a voice called out. She turned. David was there, his shirt sleeves still rolled up, his presence filling the narrow hallway. "I've heard your name mentioned several times in the handovers," he said, coming to a halt just a few feet away. "But I haven't had the chance to introduce myself properly. Dr. David Okonkwo." He stepped closer, his gaze lingering on her face with an intensity that made her pulse jump. He leaned slightly toward her, a ghost of a flirtatious smile playing on his lips, a look that said he'd noticed more than just her clinical skills. As he reached up to adjust his collar, the gold wedding ring glinted sharply under the fluorescent lights. Simone felt a sharp, bitter spike of irritation at him for being there and at herself for wanting him. "Your wife is a lucky woman, Dr. Okonkwo," she said, her voice tight, a South London edge cutting through the professional veneer. "But she's probably wondering why you're spending your 3 a.m.s flirting with midwives in the hallway." David went still. The air in the room didn't just chill, it solidified. He didn't pull his hand away. Instead, he turned the ring slowly, the metal catching the light. "My wife," he said, his voice dropping to a low, resonant vibration that seemed to come from his boots, "hasn't wondered about anything for 3 years, Midwife Richards." Simone felt the breath leave her lungs. She looked up, meeting his soul-deep eyes. They weren't just tired, they were hollowed out by a storm she recognized. "Cancer," he stated. No self-pity, just a fact. "I wear the ring because I haven't figured out how to be a man without it yet." Simone looked at the gold band, then back up at his face. The irritation was gone, replaced with a clarity that felt like a physical weight. "I'm so sorry," she murmured, her voice softening. 3 years. It's a strange thing, isn't it? How 3 years can feel like a single afternoon when you're looking at a photograph, but feel like 1,000 lifetimes when you're trying to get through a Tuesday. She reached out, as if to touch his arm, then pulled back just before contact. She gave him a small, knowing nod, the look of a woman who had seen the beginning and end of enough lives to know the truth of it. "I'll see you at the next handover, Doctor." She turned and walked away, her footsteps light and steady on the linoleum. David didn't move. He watched her retreat, his heart thudding for a reason that had nothing to do with the clinical emergency. Then he turned his gaze to the large windows overlooking the dark sprawl of Denmark Hill. He had his back to the hallway now, his white shirt stark against the night sky. He felt the weight of her words more than the weight of the ring. He looked down at the gold wedding ring still resting on his finger and began to turn it with his thumb, a nervous habit he couldn't break. The guilt was sharp and sudden. It wasn't familiar yet, but a raw, stinging thing that caught him off guard. He had come to King's to be a ghost, to mourn his late wife in the quiet routine of a new ward. He shouldn't be noticing the way a midwife's braids framed the striking beauty of her face. He shouldn't be tracing the long, elegant line of her neck with his eyes. But as he walked back towards his office, the need to see her again felt compulsory. He had spent 3 years in a fog of grief, and Simone Richards had just shocked him back to life. He wanted to get under that professional armor. He wanted her to look at him. He wanted her to see him. He found himself heading towards the staff room at 3:47 a.m., driven by a restless, hungry energy that made his palms sweat inside his pockets. The silence steady and warm. The staff room was a graveyard of flickering fluorescent lights. Simone was already there, reaching behind the ancient microwave to pull out the secret kettle. "I've been trying to find a working appliance in this building for 20 minutes, David said, leaning against the doorframe. He watched her spin around. Even in her shapeless scrubs, she held herself with a regal grace. As he stepped into the room, he caught it, the faint, warm scent of citrus and cinnamon clinging to her skin. It wasn't the room, it was her. It was intoxicating. "It's a secret," Simone said. Her voice was slightly breathy. "You have to threaten it before it boils." Threaten a kettle. He stepped closer, purposefully invading her personal space. He reached past her for a mug, his arm brushing against hers. The contact was brief, just a millisecond of bare skin against her arm, but it felt like a low-voltage shock. Simone froze. He saw the way her chest rose and fell, her eyes fixed on his forearm. "You're very quiet, Simone," he said. He stayed close, his presence heavy and warm. "I'm tired, David. It's been a long 15 years. She stopped abruptly, her eyes widening as if she'd let a secret slip. She looked away instantly, her jaw tightening with regret at the involuntary window she'd just opened into her life. 15 years, he tilted his head. He felt the weight of his own ring, but the curiosity he felt for her was stronger. "That's a long time to be holding your breath." He saw her gaze drop again to his forearm. He watched her eyes trace the veins that stood out under his skin. He felt himself reacting to her scrutiny, a tightening in the lower belly that was both a thrill and a terror. "The kettle," she managed to say, pointing at the steaming plastic. "Is it?" he asked, his voice dropping an octave. He didn't reach for the tea, he just watched her, his gaze dropping back to her mouth. He was a grown man, but standing in this dingy staff room, he felt like he was on the edge of a precipice. The guilt was there, but it was being chased by a powerful, visceral hunger. Simone fled the staff room the moment her tea was poured, her hands trembling. She retreated to a private alcove, sitting in the dark, her heart hammering. The 15 years comment burned in her mind. Why had she said it? But her body was louder than her regret. Between her thighs there was a dull, rhythmic throb she hadn't felt in a decade. Lust. It was plain and simple, and it terrified her. She thought of her flat in Brixton. She thought of how it would feel to have that scent filling her hallway. She closed her eyes and saw his smile again, those white teeth, the salt and pepper goatee, the powerful thickness of his neck. 45 years old, she hissed to herself, pressing her cool palms to her burning cheeks. But her body wasn't listening to her age. It was listening to the way David Okonkwo looked at her, as if he wanted to peel back every layer of her armor until there was nothing left but the woman underneath. Simone Richards just woke up for 15 years of sleepwalking, and David Okonkwo is about to make her feel things she thought were dead. If you're invested in whether these two tired people can find their way to each other, trust me, it gets intense. The silence over Brixton was a bruised purple and gold, but Simone hardly noticed. Her drive home from King's was a blur of gear shifts and the persistent, haunting thought of David that seemed to have woven itself into every part of her day. When she stepped into her flat, the silence greeted her like an old friend, but today it felt heavy, restless. She moved through her sanctuary with practiced efficiency. She dropped her keys on the console, kicked off her sensible work shoes, and immediately struck a match. The flame bloomed, catching the wick of her favourite candle. As the wax began to pool, the deep, woody sweetness rose to meet her, finally pushing the hospital's sterile ghost out of her lungs. She went to the kitchen and poured a glass of water, her hand stopping mid-air as she caught her reflection in the darkened window. 15 years. The words she'd accidentally dropped in the staff room echoed in the quiet kitchen. Her other hand flew to cover her face in mortification for the 100th time. Why had she said that? And how had she let 15 whole years pass? 15 years of being the sole provider. 15 years of prioritizing Marcus.
15 years with no time, space, or energy to prioritize her own needs. Well, Marcus was now living his best life at Manchester Uni, and she was here all alone in her sanctuary. She'd convinced herself that her body was a closed book, the story finished. But David Okonkwo had just cracked the spine. Simone retreated to the bathroom, the steam from the shower beginning to cloud the glass. She stripped off her scrubs, the fabric rasping against her skin. She stood before the full-length mirror waiting for the mist to clear. When it did, she didn't look away. She was 45. Her skin was a rich, deep caramel brown, still smooth, but mapped with the history of her life. She traced the lighter bronze tracks on her stomach, the marks Marcus had left behind 20 years ago. Her breasts were heavier now, her hips wider, the curves of her body more pronounced than they had been in her 20s and 30s. She reached up, carefully pinning her braids into a high bun. As she worked, she caught sight of the salt and pepper threading through the dark strands at her temples. She'd been dyeing it for years, but in the last few months she'd let it grow out. A low, liquid heat settled in her pelvis as she thought of David's reaction. Would he see the silver as age or as something earned? She touched herself, just a light graze of her own fingers along her collarbone, and shuddered. She wasn't just a midwife. She wasn't just a mother. She was a woman who had just realized that she was starving. 2 miles away, in a stark, modern flat that still felt like a hotel suite, David Okonkwo sat on the edge of his bed. The room was silent, save for the hum of the city outside. He held his left hand up, watching the light catch his wedding ring. The guilt felt like a physical weight in his chest. It felt like a betrayal to even remember the curve of Simone's lips or the way her scent had pulled her toward her in that dingy staff room. Ife had been his world. For 22 years, she was the only woman he had ever truly seen. But his thoughts about Simone weren't a threat to Ife, they were a threat to his numbness. He closed his eyes and saw the long line of Simone's neck. He felt the phantom ghost of her arm against him. He wanted to get under her armour, yes, but more than that, he wanted her to see the man who was still alive beneath the consultant's coat. He thought of her accidental confession, 15 years. He heard the loneliness in her voice, a mirror to his own. He reached out to his bedside table and picked up his phone. His thumb hovered over the ward's contact list. He'd found her number under the guise of coordinating patient handovers. Both mother and baby are stable. The mother is sleeping. I hope you are doing the same. Thank you for tonight, Simone. David. He stared at the screen, his heart pounding. It was professional, mostly, but it was a bridge. Simone's phone buzzed on the bathroom vanity just as she was stepping out of the shower. She wrapped herself in a thick white robe and picked it up. An unknown number. The baby is stable, the mother is sleeping. I hope you are doing the same. Thank you for tonight, Simone. David. Her heart skipped a beat. He'd found her number from the ward contact list. She didn't reply immediately. She walked into her bedroom and sat on the edge of her bed, her damp skin still warm from the shower, and felt the ancient, rusted gears of her heart begin to turn. She looked at her dresser, where a small bottle of bergamot-infused oil sat, a gift from Ola she'd never opened. She reached for it, unscrewing the cap. The sharp, clean scent filled the room. She rubbed a drop on her pulse points. Glad to hear it, Doctor. Get some rest. You look like you need it. It was a challenge, a playful nudge. Across London, David saw the message and smiled, his large white teeth catching the morning light. He felt the guilt recoil, just an inch, making room for a new, terrifying hope. Simone put the phone down and lay back against her pillows. For the first time in 15 years, she didn't just feel tired, she felt awake.
2 days later, Simone found herself in a large, vibrant kitchen in the quiet but opulent area of Beckenham. Ola was a whirlwind of energy, her young locks wrapped in a bright silk scarf, moving between the stove and the table with the grace of a woman who had recently reclaimed her own life.
"You're quiet, Simone," Ola said, sliding a plate of steaming rice and peas with oxtail in front of her. "And don't tell me it's the night shift. I know your tired face. This isn't it. This is your I've seen a ghost face." Simone picked at her food, the scent of the spices grounding her. "There's a consultant, David. He's observant, Ola. Too observant." Ola sat down, her eyes sharp and knowing. "Observant? Or is he looking? There's a difference, sis. A man who observes is checking his watch. A man who looks is checking for a way in." "He's widowed," Simone whispered, the words feeling heavy. "He still wears his ring, and he's Nigerian. Lagos via North London. He has this way of standing in my space, Ola. It's been so long I've forgotten the rules." "Rules?" Ola laughed, a deep, rich sound. "Babe, the only rule is survival, and you've been doing that for too long. You've built this fortress in Brixton, and you're scared he's going to see the dust on the shelves. Let him in. If he's a good man, he won't care about the dust. He'll be too busy looking at the woman who owns the house." I told him it had been 15 years. I didn't mean to. It just fell out. Ola reached across the table, squeezing Simone's hand. "Good. Let him know the stakes. You aren't some 20-something out here playing games. You're a grown woman with a life and a son and a career. If he wants a piece of that, he has to earn it. But Simone, don't starve yourself just because you're scared. You've been on a diet for 15 years. It's time to eat. And if he can't handle your appetite, that's his problem." That night, back in her flat, Simone looked at her phone. The unknown number from 2 nights ago. She saved it. David. She wasn't starving herself anymore. The simmer. The weeks following. The relationship didn't explode. It simmered. Over the next 3 weeks, they became masters of the near miss. They met in the corridors of King's, in the frantic minutes between emergencies. Each interaction was a lesson of sensory deprivation and excess. On a Tuesday, it was a shared elevator ride. The air in the small metal box was thick with the scent of his shower gel and the heat radiating off his body. David stood behind her, and Simone could feel the warmth of his chest through her scrubs, though he never touched her. "You changed your candle," he said quietly, his voice vibrating against the back of her neck. Simone's heart nearly stopped. "How could you possibly know that? You smell less cinnamon today, more like something darker, woodier." "Oud," Simone whispered, her eyes closed. "It suits you." The elevator doors opened and he stepped out without another word, leaving her trembling against the handrail. On a Friday, they were in the NICU, standing over a twin delivery. Their hands met for a second as they both reached for the same chart. His skin was hot, searingly so, and the sight of his bare chocolate hand on the white paper made Simone's stomach flip. She looked up and caught him looking at her mouth again. His warm eyes were dark, the pupils blown wide. He wanted her to look at him. He wanted her to see the man who was drowning in her presence. The tension was becoming a physical weight. Every time he flashed those straight white teeth, Simone felt a pull in her lower belly that made it hard to stand straight. Every time she caught him turning his wedding ring, she felt the sharp, jagged edge of his grief and her own fear. They were 2 professionals, 2 adults who had seen death and life in equal measure, yet they were acting like teenagers in the dark, terrified of the first spark. Finally, after a particularly brutal double shift, David found her in the parking lot. The London rain was a fine mist, turning the asphalt into a mirror. "Simone," he called out. She stopped, her hand on her car door. He walked towards her, his coat open, his breath visible in the chilly air. He stopped just inches away, too close for colleagues, just right for what they were becoming. "No more hospital tea," he said, his voice husky. "Saturday, 1 o'clock. There's a cafe in Dulwich that doesn't know either of us." Simone looked at him, really looked at him. She saw the salt and pepper in his goatee, the strength in his neck, and the desperate, naked hope in his eyes. 1 o'clock, she agreed. "Don't be late, David." "I've been waiting 15 years, he said, the words a soft, dangerous echo of her own. Saturday arrived with a sharp autumnal chill that bit through the London mist. In her Brixton flat, Simone was engaged in a battle with her own reflection. The cinnamon and oud scent was thick in the air, but today she had added a layer. She had spent an hour in the bath oiling her skin until her dark chocolate limbs glowed. She dressed with a deliberation that felt like a prayer. She chose a deep emerald knit dress that hugged her curves without screaming, cinched at the waist, and a pair of leather boots with a slight heel that made her feel powerful. She spent a long time on her face, not to mask it, but to highlight her high cheekbones and the depth of her eyes. She left her braids pinned up, refusing to cover the salt and pepper at her temples. If David was going to see her, he was going to see her, all of her. As she pulled on her coat, she felt a flare of pure, unadulterated terror. She looked at her bedroom door, and for a second she wanted to lock it and crawl back into the safety of her 15-year silence. But then she remembered the way David's bare hand had felt on her arm in the staff room, and the fear was eclipsed by a hunger so sharp it made her dizzy.
The cafe was tucked away on a quiet side street, all steamed-up windows and the smell of roasting beans. Simone arrived 5 minutes early, her heart thumping a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She saw him before he saw her. David was sitting at a small corner table, staring into a black coffee. He wasn't in scrubs or a consultant's coat. He was wearing a heavy charcoal grey wool overcoat and a grey crew-neck pullover that emphasized the powerful thickness of his neck. The salt and pepper in his goatee looked silver in the soft cafe light. He looked up as the bell above the door chimed, and when his eyes met hers, the world seemed to tilt. He stood up immediately, his movements graceful despite his size. "Simone," he said, and the way he breathed her name made her knees weak. "David." He didn't offer a handshake, and he didn't lean in for a professional peck on the cheek. He simply stood there, his expressive eyes roaming over her face, her hair and the line of her neck. He was looking at her. He was looking in her. "You look incredible," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Thank you. You look pretty good yourself. Quite different without the stethoscope." He smiled, behind his beautiful lips those straight white teeth flashing, and Simone had to grip the back of her chair to steady herself. "Sit, please." For the first 20 minutes they stayed in the shallow end. They talked about Marcus and his engineering degree, about the nightmare of South London traffic and the peculiar politics of the King's College staffing rotas. But the physical awareness was a third person at the table. Every time David leaned forward, Simone caught his scent, and her body responded with a traitorous liquid heat. Every time she reached for her latte, she saw his eyes track the movement of her throat as she swallowed. "I keep thinking about what you said," his voice dropping as he leaned in closer. The cafe noise seemed to fade into a hum. Simone felt the blood rush to her cheeks. "I shouldn't have said that. It was a moment of exhaustion." "No," he said, reaching across the table. He didn't touch her, but his hand was so close she could feel the heat radiating from his skin. "It was the first real thing anyone has said to me in 2 years. Everyone else treats me like I'm made of glass, like if they say the wrong thing, I'll shatter." "And will you?" she asked softly. "I thought I would," he admitted, his thumb absently tracing the gold wedding ring on his finger. "Until that night in the resuscitation room, when I saw you saving that baby, and then I saw you in the staff room, I realized I wasn't just grieving, I was hiding." "We both were," Simone whispered. "I want to stop hiding, Simone, but I'm terrified. I'm 49 years old, and I feel like I've forgotten how to be a man for a woman." Simone looked at his hand,
the rich, dark chocolate of his skin, the strength in his fingers. She felt a surge of boldness that surprised her. She reached out, and for the first time she initiated the contact. She laid her hand over his. The spark was instantaneous. It wasn't a shock. It was a slow, deep burn that started in her palm and travelled straight to her belly. David's breath hitched. He turned his hand over, interlacing his fingers with hers. His grip was firm, certain. "You haven't forgotten," Simone said, her voice trembling. "Believe me." They sat like that for a long time, hands joined over the scarred wooden table. The cafe was closing around them, the staff stacking chairs, but neither moved. "I have to be honest," David said, his deep eyes searching hers with an intensity that felt like a physical weight. "When I look at you, I don't just see a colleague. I see everything I've been missing, and it scares the life out of me because I don't know if I can be what you need." "Simone," Simone said, her thumb grazing the back of his hand, "I've spent 15 years being exactly what everyone else needed. My son, my patients, my ward. Right now, I just want to be what I need." "And what is that?" David looked at his mouth, at the salt and pepper of his goatee, and the hunger she had been suppressing for weeks finally clawed its way to the surface. "I want to feel alive," she whispered. "I want to remember what it feels like to be touched by someone who sees me." David squeezed her hand, his expression a mix of agony and adoration. He stood up, not letting go of her fingers, and led her out into the cold London evening. The rain had stopped, leaving the streets glistening. They stood by her car, the air between them thick with unspoken promises. "Saturday isn't over," David murmured, stepping into her space. He was so close now, she could feel the heat of his breath on her forehead. He reached up, his hand cupping her jaw, his thumb stroking the velvety silk of her cheek. He didn't kiss her, not yet. He just looked at her, his deep eyes promising a reawakening that would change everything. "I'll follow you home," he said. Simone nodded, her heart racing so fast she could barely breathe. She got into her car, her skin humming where he had touched her, and watched him in the rearview mirror as he climbed into his own vehicle. The 15-year silence was over.
The drive from Dulwich to Brixton felt like an out-of-body experience. In the rearview mirror, Simone could see the twin beams of David's headlights following her, a steady, unwavering presence through the rain-slicked streets. Every time she checked, her stomach did a slow, heavy roll. She parked her car and waited, her hands gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles turned a lighter bronze. David pulled in behind her. When he stepped out of his car, the streetlights caught the silver in his goatee, making him look like a figure carved from shadow and moonlight. They walked to the entrance of her building in silence. The air was thick with a tension so heavy it felt as if the oxygen had been replaced by something electric. Simone's hands fumbled with her keys, a rare display of clumsiness for a woman who could catch a newborn in the dark, and David reached out. His bare hand covered hers on the cold metal of the key. He didn't take it from her, he just steadied her. The heat of his palm was a shock, a reminder of the raw, masculine power he'd been holding in check all afternoon. "I've got you," he whispered, his voice a low vibration near her ear. They stepped into her flat, and the transition was immediate. The cold, damp London air was replaced by the warm, lingering embrace of cinnamon and oud. David stopped just inside the door, closing his eyes and inhaling deeply. He looked like a man who had finally found water after a long trek through a desert. "This," he murmured, his voice thick, "this is what you smell like in the hospital. I've spent weeks with this smell taunting me." "It's my sanctuary," Simone said, her voice trembling as she hung her coat. She turned to face him,
David was still standing by the door, his charcoal overcoat making him look like a mensch in her hallway. He looked around the room, at the soft lighting, the velvet cushions, the framed photos of Marcus, and then his warm eyes settled back on her. He wasn't just in her home, he was in her life. He moved toward her, his footsteps silent on the rug. He stopped just inches away, and the sensory collision was absolute. Her cinnamon met his bergamot, the sweetness of her home tangling with the sharp, clean scent of his skin. He reached out, his fingers tracing the long line of her neck, his touch so light it was almost a suggestion. Simone's head tilted back involuntarily, her eyes fluttering shut. "Simone," he breathed, "look at me." She opened her eyes. He was looking at her. He was looking in her. He saw the fear, the hunger, and the 15 years of unused desire. "I don't want to break your silence," he said, his thumb grazing her lower lip. "I want to join it." He moved his hand to the back of her head, his fingers finding the pins in her hair. One by one he removed them, his movements slow and deliberate. He wasn't rushing. This was a ritual, a careful dismantling of her professional armor. As the braids began to fall, David's breath hitched. He ran his hands through the dark, heavy plaits, his fingers grazing the salt and pepper at her temples. "You are so beautiful," he whispered, his eyes dark with an intensity that made her knees weak. "Every silver hair, every line, I want to know all of it." He moved his hands down to the emerald knit of her dress, the fabric stretching over her curves. He felt the heat of her through the wool, the rhythmic throb of her pulse beneath his palms. Simone reached out, her hands finding the hem of his pullover. She felt the powerful thickness of his neck, the corded muscle that spoke of strength and restraint. She pulled him closer, her fingers digging into the soft wool. "David," she whispered, her voice a plea for the reawakening she'd been terrified of wanting. Behind his beautiful lips, those straight white teeth flashed as he let out a jagged breath. He leaned in, pressed his cheek against hers. 15 years, he murmured, the echo of her secret. "I want to spend the next 15 making you forget why you were ever alone." He slid his cheek along hers, never breaking contact, until he pressed a slow, lingering kiss to the velvety silk of her cheek, right where her pulse was jumping. Then slid the heat of his lips to press another to her jaw. Then he slowly, deliberately tilted her head back and moved to the long line of her neck. He sniffed deeply, bit gently, then sucked where he'd bidden. Simone let out a soft, broken sound, a whimper of release. The dull throb she'd felt for weeks in the hospital corridors exploded into a vibrant, living heat. She felt the rough texture of his goatee against her skin, the warmth of his breath, and the heavy weight of his hands on her waist. He pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes. His hot gaze was a promise. He reached for her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. His palm was broad and calloused, a stark contrast to the softness of her own, and she felt the cool metal of his gold wedding ring against the small of her back. It didn't feel like a barrier anymore. It felt like an admission of shared history, of two people who had survived the dark and were finally reaching for the light. She led him down the narrow corridor, past the framed memories of a life built on solitude, toward the door at the end. She felt the heavy, rhythmic thud of his pulse through her grip. She was the architect of this moment. She was finally guiding someone into the center of her world. "Are you sure?" he asked, his voice a husky rasp. Simone looked at him, at the man who looked in her and didn't turn away. She reached up, her fingers tracing the silver in his goatee. "I've never been sure of anything in my life," she said. When they crossed the threshold of her bedroom, the low light of a single lamp cast long, amber shadows across the walls. The room smelled faintly of lavender and the fading sweetness of the living room candles. Simone turned to face him, her heart a frantic drum. David didn't wait. He reached out, his hands framing her face with a reverence that made her breath catch. It wasn't the tentative, polite kiss of a first date. It was an arrival. When his lips finally met hers, it was a collision of years of suppressed hunger. He tasted of black coffee in the cold evening air. It was deep, slow, and possessive. Simone let out a broken sound, her hands sliding up the charcoal wool of his coat to find the warmth of his neck. He groaned into her mouth, a low, primal vibration that she felt in her very marrow. His goatee was a soft, prickling friction against her skin, the warmth of his breath and the heavy weight of his hands on her waist. He pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes. His hot gaze was a promise. He reached for her hand, his fingers interlacing with hers. His palm was broad and calloused, a stark contrast to the softness of her own, and she felt the cool metal of his gold wedding ring against the small of her back. It didn't feel like a barrier anymore. It felt like an admission of shared history, of two people who had survived the dark and were finally reaching for the light. The emerald dress pooled at her feet, a dark silk spill on the floor. Simone stood before him in the dim light, her breath hitching as David's gaze travelled over her. She felt the familiar urge to cover herself, to hide the parts of her that 45 years had claimed. But David stepped closer, his hands finding her waist. He didn't look away from the tracks of lighter bronze on her stomach. He knelt, his large hands splaying past the map of her stretch marks. He pressed a slow, lingering kiss to the center of them. "Beautiful," he murmured against her skin, "a map of what you've given the world." He rose, his hands moving upward to the weight of her breasts. He held her with a quiet awe, his thumbs grazing the tips until she arched into him. He loved the fullness of her, the way she felt substantial and real in his arms. When she moved, there was a soft, rhythmic jiggle to her flesh, the honest, unburdened weight of a mature woman. David didn't just accept it, he seemed to crave it. He pulled her flush against him, his coat and pullover discarded, his bare chest a wall of solid, radiating heat. He lifted her easily, the strength in his arms a shock to her system, and she instinctively wrapped her legs around his waist, a move that felt vulnerable and powerful at the same time. When he laid her back on the cool sheets, the heavy weight of his body settling over her stole her breath. He was substantial. He was a mountain of muscle and intent. Simone tightened her legs around his waist, pulling him into the cradle of her hips. She felt the cool metal of his gold wedding ring against the small of her back. It didn't feel like a barrier anymore. It felt like an admission of shared history, of two people who had survived the dark and were finally reaching for the light. "Look at me," he commanded softly. Simone opened her eyes. He was looking at her. He was looking in her. His joining with her was a slow, deliberate pressure that felt like a homecoming. It wasn't just a physical union, it was a claiming. Simone gasped, her fingers digging into the corded muscle of his shoulders as he filled the 15-year void. He moved with a steady, powerful rhythm that demanded she stay with him. He didn't rush. He watched her face as he claimed her, his own expression a mask of concentration and raw, naked need. The weight of him was a comfort she hadn't known she was missing, the physical proof that she was no longer alone in the dark. In the quiet of the Brixton night, the only sound was the jagged rhythm of their shared breath and the soft, rhythmic creak of the bed as two lives finally, passionately, became one. If this story is touching a place in you that's been quiet for too long, let me know in the comments. Have you ever felt that arrival, that moment where you realize you don't have to be the strong one anymore? I'd love to hear your thoughts. If you're enjoying The Night Shift,
please hit that like button and subscribe to Heart, Soul and Melanin. It helps the algorithm find the other strong ones out there who need to know that it's never too late for a new beginning. But the morning always follows the night, and for Simone and David, the morning brings the hospital corridors, the weight of the past, and the reality of a gold ring that still holds a lot of ghosts. How do you build a future when the past hasn't quite let go? The early morning light in Simone's bedroom was filtered through the heavy linen curtains, casting the room in a soft, hazy grey. Simone woke first. She lay still, her body feeling heavy and used in a way she hadn't experienced in a lifetime. Beside her, David was a mountain of warmth. The weight of his arm across her waist was a solid, grounding presence. She watched the slow, rhythmic rise and fall of his chest, his skin smooth and vast. She felt the heat rising again within her, but slipped carefully out from under his arm to freshen up in the bathroom. When she was back in the bed, she lay still next to him, absorbing his presence in the morning. The silence was different now. It wasn't the hollow silence of a woman alone. It was the comfortable, breathing silence of two people who had survived a storm. David stirred, a low grumble vibrating in his chest. He shifted, pulling her closer into the curve of his body, his face burying into the crook of her neck. His salt and pepper goatee was a soft friction against her skin. "Hey," he rasped, his voice thick with sleep. "Hey," she whispered, turning in his arms to face him. His dark eyes were clear, warm, searching hers. He didn't look like a consultant now. He looked like a man who had finally laid down a heavy burden. He reached up, his thumb grazing her lower lip, his gaze dropping to the silver at her temples. "You're even more beautiful in the daylight," he murmured. "Stay right there. I'll be back." It was a command and a promise. The heat and the heaviness swept through her. She stayed right there. The domesticity of the morning was a slow, tender dance. David made coffee in her small kitchen, his large frame making the space look like a dollhouse. He found her stash of condensed milk, grinning as he added a generous pour to his mug. "My mother would approve," he said, leaning against her counter. They didn't talk about the hospital. They talked about the light in the room, the scent of her candles, and the strange, beautiful reality of the last 12 hours. But as the clock ticked toward the afternoon, the outside world began to bleed back in. "We have the night shift tonight," Simone said, her hand resting on his forearm. David's expression shifted, a flicker of professional mask returning, though his eyes remained warm. "I know. It's going to be difficult, being in that ward and not reaching for you. We're professionals, David. We've been doing this a long time." "I know," he said, setting his mug down and pulling her closer between his legs. He held her tight, his cheek resting on her head. "The secret is going to be hard to keep." Walking into King's College Hospital at 7 p.m. felt like stepping into a different dimension. The familiar hum of the monitors, the sharp scent of antiseptic, the frantic energy of the handover. It was all the same, yet everything had changed. Simone was in the middle of a handover with Marie when David walked onto the ward. He was back in another creased shirt, his stethoscope draped around his neck. He looked every bit the authority figure, steady, distant and focused. "Dr. Okonkwo," Cherie said, nodding to him. "We have a slow progress in room 6. Midwife Richards was just briefing me." David looked at Simone. To anyone else, it was a standard professional gaze, but Simone saw it. He was looking in her. Behind his beautiful lips, she saw the ghost of a smile, a secret shared between the lines of his deep eyes. "Thank you, midwife," he said, his voice a steady rumble. "I'll review the charts. Carry on." He walked past her, his shoulder brushing her for a fraction of a second, a deliberate hidden contact that sent a jolt of electricity straight to her core. Simone took a breath, the scent of the ward filling her lungs, but underneath it all she could still smell a hint of bergamot. She looked at Marie, who was already moving toward the monitors, and then back to David's retreating figure.
She was 45, she was a senior midwife, and for the first time in 15 years, the night shift didn't feel long enough. It had been 8 months since they first sat in that Dulwich caquet, and nearly 4 years since David had been widowed. Their time together hadn't always been easy. She had held his hand through the days that hurt the most, the anniversary of Ife's passing, her birthday, the other anniversaries. She'd given him space on the quiet, heavy nights when he needed it. But 8 months into their relationship, the safe space Simone had built for herself felt less like a sanctuary and more like a waiting room. The autumn air had turned to a biting winter chill. David was in Simone's kitchen, the familiar scent of her cinnamon and oud candles thick in the air. He was making tea, moving with the practiced ease of a man who knew exactly where she kept the ginger and the honey. But as he reached for the kettle, the overhead light struck the gold ring on his left hand. Simone watched him from the doorway. Over the last 8 months, she had learned to look past it, to tell herself it was just a piece of metal, but lately it had begun to feel like a barricade. Every time they were intimate, she felt the cool edge of that gold against her skin. Every time they held hands, it was the first thing she felt. "You're in your head again," David said, turning with 2 mugs. He saw her expression, and his smile faltered. "I'm 46, David," she said quietly, not taking the tea. "I don't have another 15 years to wait for a man to decide if I'm a permanent fixture or a temporary comfort. Simone, we've talked about this. I'm here. I'm with you every night that I'm not on call. You're in my bed, David, but you're still keeping your life reserved for a ghost. I took you into my world. I let you see my mess, my stretch marks, my grey hair. I let you under my professional armour. But I feel like I'm auditioning for a role that was already cast 20 years ago. You've taken me out of my safe space, and now I'm standing in the cold while you keep 1 foot in a grave." David set the mugs down, the porcelain clinking sharply against the counter. He looked at his hand, his thumb reflexively turning the ring. "It's been part of me for half my life, Simone. Taking it off feels like letting her die all over again. And keeping it on feels like letting us die before we've even started," she whispered.
The tension followed them to a dinner at Eniola's a week later. It was a milestone, the first time David was officially meeting Simone's inner circle as her partner, not just a friend from work. Eniola's house in Peckham was rich with the blended scents of jollof rice, curry goat and fried plantain amongst other foods, alive with the thrum of R&B, hip-hop, Afro beats and everything in between. Eniola moved through the room with her growing locks swinging, her eyes missing nothing. She had been the one to push Simone toward David, but she was also the fiercest guardian of Simone's heart. Over dinner, the conversation was lively, but the energy was skewed. David was charming, his dark eyes warm as he spoke about his work, but every time he moved his left hand, the table seemed to go silent for Simone. In the kitchen, while they were helping with the dessert, Eniola cornered Simone. "He's fine, Simone. I see why you're hooked. He looks in you just like you said," Eniola whispered, her voice low and urgent. "But that ring is a loud neighbour, babe. It's been 8 months of us and 20 years of her. Is he moving in, or is he just a long-term guest?" "He's still grieving, Ola. It's complicated." "No," Eniola disagreed, her face softening with pity. "You've spent 15 years building a kingdom for yourself. Don't let a man stay in it for free if he's still paying rent somewhere else. You look heart-tired, sis. You took the risk, you let him in, now he needs to show up or get out of the way." When they returned to Brixton that night, the silence in the flat was no longer a comfort. It felt like a void. David turned to her in the hallway. "Your friend doesn't trust me." "My friend loves me," Simone corrected, her voice quiet, "and she sees what I've been trying to ignore." Simone stayed in the doorway, arms crossed. She wasn't crying, she wasn't emotional.
She was just tired. "David, I can't keep doing this," she said, her voice flat, matter of fact. "I've made space for you here, in my home, in my life. But every single time I think we're actually building something, I look down and see that damn ring, and I realize I'm still waiting for you to show up fully. I'm competing with a memory, and I can't win." His hand went to the ring automatically. He didn't even realize he was doing it anymore, just twisted it with his thumb like a nervous tick. "It's not a competition, Simone," he said quietly. "You know that's not what this is." "Then what is it?" she asked, not angry, just done. "Because from where I'm standing, you've got one foot in my flat and the other foot in a grave, and I'm the one who has to watch you decide which one matters more." He exhaled hard, rubbing his face. "You think this is easy for me? You think I don't want to just be here, to not feel like I'm betraying her every time I'm happy with you?" Simone's voice cracked, just a little. "She's gone, David. She's been gone for 4 years. And I'm sorry, I am. But I'm here, right now. And I need to know if you're actually with me, or if I'm just keeping the bed warm until you figure out how to forgive yourself." He looked at her, and for a moment she saw it. The fear, the guilt. The man who'd built his entire identity around being the widower and didn't know who he was without it. "I don't know how to let go of her and still be a good man," he admitted, his voice low and raw. "If I take this off," he held up his hand, "if I stop carrying her with me and I just let her go, what does that say about what we had? That it meant nothing? That I can just move on?" Simone's jaw tightened. She wanted to comfort him. She'd spent months doing exactly that. But tonight, she just couldn't. "You're already moved on, David. You're in my bed. You're in my kitchen. You know where I keep the honey, for God's sake. But you're still treating me like I'm temporary, like I'm something you're trying out while you work through your feelings. And I'm too frickin' old for that." Hearing herself say those words, speak her truth, she realized that she had already made her decision. She walked to the door and opened it. The cold air from outside rushed in, sharp and unwelcome. "Go home," she said quietly. "Go back to your flat and your memories and your guilt. I was fine before you, I can be fine again. But I won't be someone's backup plan while they figure out if they're ready to live." David stood there, staring at her like he wanted to argue, to fix it, to say the right thing. But nothing came, because deep down, he knew she was right. He walked past her, stopped at the threshold, and turned back one last time. "Simone, don't," she said, not looking at him. "Just don't." He left. The door closed, and for the first time in 8 months, Simone's flat was quiet again. Not peaceful, just quiet. The weeks following the breakup were a slow, agonizing return to the grey. Simone retreated into her work with a ferocity that worried even the most seasoned colleagues. She was the first one on the ward and the last to leave, her professional mask so seamless it felt like porcelain. But at King's, you could not truly hide. Every time the double doors hissed open, her body betrayed her. Her skin would prickle, her lungs searching for a hint of bergamot in the recycled air. When David did appear for a neonatal review, the distance between them was cavernous. They spoke in the shorthand of clinicians, brief, cold, and devastatingly polite. He looked terrible. The salt and pepper in his goatee seemed more silver than black, and the light in his soulful eyes had been replaced by a hollow, haunted stare. He still wore the ring. The breaking point didn't happen on the ward. It happened in Simone's kitchen. Marcus had come down from Manchester for a weekend, his presence filling the flat with the scent of laundry detergent and youthful energy. He sat at the table, watching his mother move. She was cleaning a counter that was already spotless, her movements jerky and forced. "Mum," Marcus said, catching her hand. "Stop! You're vibrating!" Simone tried to pull away, but he held on. He was 20 now, with his father's height but his mother's eyes that could see right through a performance. "I'm just tired, Marcus. The shifts have been—" "It's not the shifts," he interrupted. "The flat smells like you're trying to bury something. Too much oud, not enough air. And you haven't mentioned David once." Simone froze. She hadn't realised she'd mentioned him enough for Marcus to notice the silence. "It didn't work out," she said, her voice brittle. "He wasn't ready to leave his past behind, and I was tired of waiting." Marcus leaned back, his expression unusually grave. "You know, when Dad first left, you closed every curtain in this house, and then you stayed in the dark for 15 years to make sure I was safe. But I'm grown now, Mum. You don't have to stay in the dark for me. If he's the one who made you turn the lights back on, maybe he's worth the struggle, even if he's a bit broken." "He's still married to a ghost," Simone said. "Then tell him that, not as a midwife, but as a woman. Don't let your safe space become a prison again just because you're scared of a little mess." Across the city, David was sitting in his darkened apartment, the silence of the room pressing against him. He looked at the photo of Ife on his mantel, then down at the gold band on his finger. For 2 years, the ring had been his anchor, but as he thought of Simone, the velvety silk of her cheek, the way she had looked in him, the way she had welcomed him into her sanctuary, he realised the anchor had become a noose. He was strangling his future to preserve a memory that was already etched in his heart. He thought of the feel of Simone in his arms, the honest jiggle of her flesh, the shimmer of her stretch marks, the direct, honest way she did everything. She had offered him her truth, and he hid behind a piece of metal. He thought of the hospital. He thought of the way she looked at him now, with a professional respect that felt like a death sentence. He realised then that Simone hadn't just been a transition, she was the destination, and if he didn't move now, he would be a ghost long before he was ever buried. The confrontation happened at 3:47 a.m. in the small, flickering staff room. Simone was reaching for the secret kettle when she felt the air change. The scent of bergamot arrived before he did. She didn't turn around. "Simone." His voice was closer than she expected. She turned. David was standing less than a metre away, looking raw, professional armour stripped away. Without a word, he held up his left hand. The finger was bare. There was a pale, thin circle of skin where the gold had lived for 2 decades, but the ring was gone. "I put it in a box," he said quietly. "It will always be in my heart, but it belongs to my history, not my future." Simone looked at the pale mark on his finger, then up at his face. Her chest felt tight. "We can't do this here," she whispered. "I know. Can I come over after shift?" She hesitated, then nodded once. After shift. Simone's flat was quiet in the grey morning light. She'd barely had time to light her candle when she heard the knock. 3 soft taps that somehow felt different from every other time he'd stood at her door. She opened it. David stood there in his coat, still in his scrubs underneath, looking like he hadn't slept. The pale band on his finger caught the hallway light. "Come in," she said.
He stepped inside, and the familiar scent of Simone's flat hit him like a physical thing. He'd missed it, missed her. They stood in the hallway for a long moment, neither quite knowing how to start. "I need you to understand something," David said finally, his voice low and rough. "When Ife died, I thought my life was over. I didn't think I'd ever feel anything again. And then you walked into that recess room, and for the first time in 3 years, I felt awake. It terrified me." Simone wrapped her arms around herself. "So you kept the ring on to remind yourself not to feel too much." "I kept it on because I didn't know how to be a man without it," he admitted. "But these last few weeks without you, Simone, I've been more lost and hopeless than I ever was before." He took a step closer. She didn't back away. "I went to her grave yesterday," he continued, his voice cracking. "I told her about you, about how you make me laugh, how you don't take my rubbish, how you look at me like I'm not broken. And I realised she'd be furious with me for wasting this, for wasting you." Simone's eyes were wet now, but she still didn't speak. "I'm not asking you to compete with a memory," David said, his voice cracking. "I'm asking you to let me build a life with you, a real one. I'm asking to come home." "This isn't just about the ring, David," she whispered. "I need you to know you're all in, not halfway, not 1 foot out the door." "I'm in," he said, and the certainty in his voice finally broke something loose in her chest. She looked at him, really looked at him, saw the exhaustion, the vulnerability, the man who'd finally chosen to live again. "Don't make me regret this," she breathed. "Never." He closed the distance between them in 2 steps. His hands came up to frame her face, warm, solid, real, and then he crashed his lips down to hers. It wasn't gentle, it was desperate, hungry and fierce, the kiss of 2 people who'd been starving themselves and were finally able to feast. Simone made a sound low in her throat and grabbed the front of his coat, pulling him closer, needing to feel the weight of him, the realness of him. His hand slid from her face to her waist, his arms sliding round her and hauling her against him, as if he wanted to absorb her. David backed her against the wall, pressing hard against her. His hands came back to her face as he rained kisses all over it. She preened and stretched with satisfaction, even as she pulled him into her, desperate to have him even closer. As they broke apart, David rested his forehead against hers, fighting to control his emotions. "I've missed you," he rasped. "God, Simone, I've missed you." "Then don't leave again," she whispered, her fingers still twisted in his coat. "I won't." He kissed her again, slower this time, but no less intense. His hands found the hem of her jumper, fingers brushing the skin of her waist, and she shivered. "David!" "Tell me to stop," he murmured against her mouth. "If this is too fast, after where we've come from, I'll stop." Instead, she took his hand, the one with the pale band of skin, and placed it over her heart. He could feel it racing under his palm. "I don't want you to stop. I want you to stay." He kissed her neck, right where her pulse was jumping, and felt her knees buckle slightly. He caught her, steadied her, then lifted her easily, exactly the way he had that first night, and she wrapped her legs around his waist. "Bedroom?" he asked, his voice rough. "Yes." He laid her down on the bed, and the late morning light turned everything soft and golden. He shrugged out of his coat, pulled off his scrubs, and when he settled over her, the weight of him felt like an answer to a question she'd been asking for weeks. "Look at me," she whispered, echoing what he'd said to her all those months ago. He did. His dark eyes were clear, present, here. "I see you, all of you, and I'm not going anywhere." When he kissed her again, when they finally came together in the quiet sanctuary of her flat, it wasn't just passion, it was a promise, a choice. 2 people who'd survived the dark deciding to reach for the light together.
After, they lay tangled in her sheets, her head on his chest, his leg over hers, his hand running slow, heavy and possessive from her neck down to her bottom and back up again, claiming her as his. "We're doing this properly," Simone said quietly. "No more half measures. You're either here or you're not." "I'm here," David said, kissing the top of her head. "I'm home." And for the first time in 15 years, Simone's flat didn't just feel like her sanctuary, it felt like theirs. The coming out of Midwife Richards and Dr. Okonkwo wasn't marked by an announcement, but by the quiet death of 100 small pretenses. It was the way David started bringing 2 Tupperware containers for the 3 a.m. lulls. It was the way Simone stopped stiffening when he entered a room, her body instead leaning imperceptibly towards his heat like a flower to the sun. The Ward family, the porters, the HCAs, the cleaners, watched with the sharp, proprietary eyes of people who had seen these two survive the trenches alone for too long. The official confirmation happened during a particularly grueling Friday night. The ward was over capacity, 3 sirens were wailing in the distance, and the air was thick with the scent of adrenaline and floor wax. In the middle of the chaos, David caught Simone's eye across the nursing station. He didn't speak. He simply walked over, took the heavy charting folder from her cramped hand, and replaced it with a bottle of water he'd already unscrewed. Then he reached out and tucked a stray silver-threaded braid back behind her ear. It was a domestic gesture, performed in the centre of the NHS storm. Marie, leaning against the desk, let out a soft, satisfied hum. "About time," she muttered. The laughter that rippled through the station was the sound of the Ward family closing ranks around them. 2 of their best had finally found a soft place to land. The true ending happened on a quiet Saturday evening in March. David had gone to Ife's grave that morning, alone. He needed to say goodbye properly, to explain that loving again didn't erase what they'd had, it honoured it by choosing to keep living. When he arrived at Simone's flat that evening, she opened the door in a soft sweater, her braids pinned up, the silver at her temples catching the lamplight. "Simone," he began, taking her hands and pulling her into the living room, the sanctuary where he'd first tasted her tea and where she'd cried about the ring. "You let me into your world when I was a lost soul clinging to my grief and memories. You held space for me. You created new memories with me. You've helped me rediscover myself." He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small velvet box. Inside was a band of hammered rose gold, set with a single glowing, perfectly set diamond. "I don't want to be a guest here anymore. I want to wake up here every morning. I want to grow old in this flat that smells like home." He knelt on one knee. "Will you marry me?" Simone looked down at the man who had looked in her until she finally saw herself again. "Yes," she whispered, her voice breaking. "Yes, David." As he slipped the ring on her finger, the rose gold was warm against her dark skin. The 15-year silence was over. The sun was finally up.
And so, in a small flat in Brixton, the sun finally rose on a love that refused to stay in the shadows. Simone and David's journey reminds us that no matter how many years we've spent in the winter of our lives, it is never too late for a second spring, as long as we are brave enough to lay down the ghosts of the past. At Heart, Soul and Melanin, we believe our stories are our power. We tell them not just to entertain, but to see ourselves reflected in all our complexity, our resilience, and our capacity for joy. If Simone and David's story touched your heart, please subscribe, join our community, and tell us what you thought of the story. Your input will help me to keep telling these unapologetic stories of Black love and life, and to keep getting better at it. Next week, we return to the London Love Stories universe with another passionate, heartfelt, soulful love story. Hit the notification bell to make sure you don't miss it. We'd hate for you to be endlessly scrolling trying to find us in your feed. Yep, we've been there. So see you in the next one. And until then, remember, you've got a multitude of stories still to explore in your life, and even in the longest night shift, the light is always coming. This is Heart, Soul and Melanin. Thank you so much for listening.